Good evening and welcome to tonight's evening news, where we bring you weekly coverage of the conflict that has embroiled humanity for the past several weeks. News from the League of Nations as the commander of the improvised multinational force that drove the Morganas from Rotterdam gambled it all. The fleet was going to assault the Morgana Knot in the Skagerrak Strait. With assistance from the Allies, the Germans, and the Soviets, humanity had a good chance of winning. The League of Nations would have proof that the world's navies could turn the tide. But if the warring nations refused to help, the captain, and everything the captain represented, would certainly perish. It would all be decided in the days ahead. News from the Allies as ORP Orzel slipped internment in Estonia on the 18th of October, using a clever ruse and a little sabotage. Rumor from the British Embassy in Moscow is that her bell appeared when the submarine grounded and she personally heaved it off the bar. The journey to Scotland would take at least 40 days, if they were careful and lucky. There could be no communications, no hint of progress. All that remained was to hope. News from Italy as this week the Regia Marina finally achieved a measure of justice for La Spezia. The Morgana Vanity, using material harvested from the Italian port, had begun an elaborate engineering project in the Tyrrhenian Sea, a stunningly, inhumanly gorgeous palace of reflective surfaces and fine ground scan, sculpted into fantastic shapes. It was a provocation that Italy could not allow. On the 14th of October, the battle fleet sortied from Taranto. As the sun rose on the 15th, they were caught at a disadvantage when the incomplete palace caught the light of the sun. Its brilliance was literally blinding, and it made it impossible to range on the enemy. Only as distance and aspect changed were the Italians able to begin effective fire, and even that was only possible as the enemy had not raised steam at the beginning of the battle. Close action with the Vanities might have proved catastrophic, but Italian armor was generally proof against the poor shell quality of the Morganas, and the battle ended with the remnants put to flight. It was not without cost. The Ione Pancaldo was sunk as she bravely attempted a torpedo run, and much of the battle fleet will need repair. It is clear that the Regia Marina will have some difficulty sortying in force in the coming months. The battle was noteworthy in that several varieties of Vanity were present. Destruction of the palace took a day of shelling before the structure collapsed, and was unusually traumatic for the sailors involved. Perhaps it was because many of them had fought non-stop for weeks on very little sleep and on restricted diets, or perhaps it was the stress levels were high to begin with. But, whatever the reason, the destruction of a work of startling beauty, however monstrous its functions, proved devastating to morale. Raimondo Montecuccoli, who is credited for firing the final salvo that brought the palace down, had to be towed to Naples as her crew broke down into tears or flung themselves into the sea. The situation was similar, albeit less extreme, on other ships. Vanity swore revenge. In fact, it was the first recorded case of any Morgana specifically declaring hostile intent against a human nation. In the Far East with Japan, at Emperor Showa's request, the IJN and IJA together took steps to prepare Tokyo and the Yokosuka naval arsenal for an unprecedented request. The Tenno was rumored to be planning for a meeting of the Arahitogami, and a ceremony could not be marred by the Morganas. The Prime Minister's new government was bolstered by this example of cooperation and accord, and the general readiness of the nation to face the current circumstances with courage and endurance was similarly affected. Meanwhile, the Funayuri were becoming more and more of a presence in the waters to the south, though fortunately for Japan, their fury was more directed at the Philippines than at Japanese territory. Appeals for support from Manila were answered with sympathy, but no material support. There was only so much the IJN could organize on short notice, particularly since Governor-General Kobayashi in Taihoku was filling increasingly desperate appeals for more naval support for Taiwan. News from the United States, as with Manila under siege and increasing reports of Morgana sightings around Guam, the U.S. Navy decided it was time to project force further out in the Pacific, and so the fleet moved from San Jose to Honolulu. Very present in their calculations was this: Hawaii conferred significant advantages in logistics and supply, as the fleet continued westward to relieve the Philippines. If the enemy came for Pearl Harbor, then by God they would find a fight waiting for them. Meanwhile, just north of Puerto Rico, a storm began to grow. It didn't move, it didn't change with the temperatures or bend unduly to greater air currents. It simply wrapped itself like a shroud around the Puerto Rican coast and slowly stretched out for Hispaniola and the Virgin Islands. No one had ever seen anything like it before, and where its shadow fell, Morganas seemed to gather. Across the Atlantic with the United Kingdom, It was a week of public disasters and a week of subtle progress. Admiral French's and Admiral Forbes' long-delayed plan to improve the security of Scapa Flow was begun, calling for additional cables and defenses at the main entrances, and new block ships for the lesser channels. It was not begun quickly enough to avert the coming disaster, however. Just before dawn on the 14th of October, with the greater portion of the home fleet at sea, Royal Oak slept contentedly. At about 3:05 a.m. local time, and wholly without warning, a salvo of torpedoes slammed into her, opening her to the sea and flooding her to a 15-degree list. In the panic of fires and the attack, the bell of the Royal Oak manifested, seemingly willing the water to stop its progress and furiously engaging her tormentor, an unknown silver-black Morgana of considerable stealth and speed. As her crew struggled to get their action stations, Royal Oak dueled the strange Morgana, driving her westward into the bay. The patrolling destroyers there were hard put to engage the enemy and avoid Royal Oak's furious fire at the same time. The unmoored Morgana thrashed under the assault, and yet might have made good her escape were it not for an unexpected volley of precise fire from the direction of Rice a Little. The Morgana was caught between the unexpected attack and Royal Oak's incoming fire, and was quickly struck by multiple fatal shells. As the Morgana sank, seemingly dissolving the cold water of the bay, Royal Oak used the last of her strength to get as many of her crew to their boats as possible. Her power at last failing, the waters finally broke through her defenses, and she sank, turning over, at about 4:21 a.m. At around the same time, Sedition began broadcasting the death of the Royal Oak at the hands of a German U-boat. 2 days later, in another blow to morale, German bombers delivered their payloads to the Firth of Forth. Hitler was certainly delighted. This was a horrifying answer to the defeat of the Kriegsmarine in the North Sea, and one the apparently overstretched Royal Navy seemed ill-equipped to deter in the future. In fact, the underlying state of affairs at Scapa Flow was very much improved by the end of the attack. The Morgana had gotten profoundly lucky in her attack, and the weakness she'd exploited was immediately filled. But the heroic battle of Royal Oak against her assassins made the hearts and minds of the United Kingdom more determined, and more ready to face an uncertain future. Meanwhile, a secret expedition into the Arctic Circle failed to signal at the agreed-upon time. Whether it was due to mines, whether Germans or Morganas was unknown, but it certainly seemed they were lost. Meanwhile, south in France, the Marine Nationale's auxiliary bell captains continued to integrate into a loose but effective structure. This heightened confidence in government and army circles that the appearance of the bells would not significantly diminish the ability of France to fight the war. A notable example of this collaboration was the expertise that certain bells were able to provide to the newly established PC Bruno in an effort to decrypt Morgana communications. The time and expertise provided by the bells was instrumental in discovering important intelligence about the Morgana mischief, originally broadcast somewhere near Gulf de Saint-Tropez, and whatever communications were intercepted were deemed important enough to go straight to Daldier. Funding of Morgana decryption efforts tripled before the week was out. The Marine Nationale was instructed to make every effort to listen in on Morgana transmissions, no matter how disturbing some of them might have been, or how dreadful some of the subsequent dreams may have been for those who were ordered to listen. News from Britain was uniformly bad. Impregnable Scapa Flow had been infiltrated by the Morganas, and Royal Oak was sunk after a desperate battle. Meanwhile, Paranoia chased mischief away from St. Tropez, and apparently began patrolling the area to prevent her fellow Morgana's return. Over in Germany, members of the Kriegsmarine were startled to hear a series of Morgana broadcasts proclaiming that U-boats had attacked and sunk HMS Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, particularly those senior officers who had convinced Donitz not to go ahead with the plan. It proved to be misinformation, yes. The Morganas themselves made the attack, but their false story was so detailed and had so much knowledge of Plan P that it raised fears of Morgana spycraft. A bombing run on the Firth of Forth was almost delayed as a result, but proceeded as planned on the 16th. Although not a great success for Germany, it did remind the United Kingdom that they were not out of reach. Apart from the U-boats, the Kriegsmarine were sealed away from the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Morgana concentrations in the Skagerrak Strait were worse than they had ever been, and the Allies were still intent on maintaining as much of their own blockade as this situation would allow. When German news reported that Britain and the Morganas were working hand in hand against Germany, it wasn't much of an exaggeration. In the midst of all that, the Polish submarine Orzel slipped internment in Estonia on the 18th of October, escaping hours before the Soviets arrived at Tallinn. It is said that her bell appeared when she grounded off a sandbar, and she personally heaved the submarine off, during all the machine gun fire of the harbor guard. The Kriegsmarine promptly began combing the routes out of the Baltic, but did not discover the submarine. This did not prevent a formal closure of the naval war by the OKM, however. 3 Polish submarines were interned in Sweden, and Orzel was recorded as lost at sea, thus ending victoriously the Baltic Naval War against the Allies. The League of Nations proposed mounting a formal investigation, giving persuasive rumors that Orzel's bell woke in Tallinn before the attempted escape, but by the end of the week Germany still had not agreed to participate. A rebuff of Finnish invitation to participate in the negotiations with the Soviet Union were poorly received in Helsinki. Finally, with the Soviet Union, the Morgana disease had been operating in the Black Sea for weeks, and in her wake an exotic plague bloomed. It originally presented with symptoms similar to yellow fever, but uncommonly severe. But as time went on, radical neurological effects became more and more evident. It was weeks before anyone realized that the mosquitoes transmitting the disease were themselves unnatural, adapting to mild and moderately cold conditions. The Kingdom of Romania was as interested as the Soviets in hunting down the cause. As the Black Sea Fleet targeted disease formations wherever they were found, Soviet and Romanian doctors and scientists risked their own health prowling the Danube Delta, looking for clues and tending to the afflicted. Meanwhile, in the Baltic, ORP Orzel's escape from Tallinn was treated with great suspicion, a breach of Estonian neutrality at best, outright treachery at worst. Wherever she ended up, she was not where she rightly belonged. It was another site that the USSR had to assert itself soon, before the local neighbors, both the Germans and the Finns, decided that they were too soft for the moment in which they lived. Thank you for joining this week's broadcast, and be sure to tune in next week for more updates from the front lines around the world.